Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thank you so much for being with me today. Today, my guest is McKay Garner. And if you're not familiar with McKay, he is a producer, engineer, mixer, multi-instrumentalist, composer. He's done it all, and he's worked with a ton of great artists such as J Dilla, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Mike Shinoda of Linkin Park, Michael Buble, Dead & Company, and a whole bunch more. He's also had music that has been featured in the Transformers movie, in video games, TV shows such as Total Recall, America's Next Top Model, Grey's Anatomy, and a whole bunch more. And in this conversation, we have a great chat all about the arrangement of music and how it's so important to understand how every element of your arrangement comes into play and how it can make a big difference in terms of the clarity of your overall mixes. By planning in advance, by actually really visualizing where things are going to go, you can actually almost guarantee the success of your mix if you've worked on the arrangement well enough. You just have to be mindful of, what elements are going to fit where, which registers things are going to be sitting in, and a whole bunch more. We get into a lot of detail inside of this episode. And another great topic that we get into with this episode as well is the idea of writing music for film and TV. And since McKay has a lot of experience in this, we get into some of the details about different revenue streams for people who are interested in this and how to actually get your music picked for this, who to talk to. I know that there are a lot of people listening to this podcast who have built a big catalog of music and they're wondering, how do you make money off of this stuff? Or how do you actually get it in the hands of the people that matter? Well, with all the tips that McKay gives you in this interview, I think you're going to get a very clear plan of action for some things you can do to put your music out there and hopefully get it licensed and make some money off of it. So I think you're going to really enjoy this interview. McKay is a really fun guy. He's also a very visual person, so if you're a visual learner, you're definitely going to find this interview very helpful because he has a really great way of describing things in a way that you can very easily visualize it and relate to everything he has to say. So with that said, let's just jump right into today's interview. McKay Garner, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How are you today?
I'm great, man. It's my pleasure to be here.
Amazing. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us that little background on who you are, what you do, and how you got into music and production and mixing and all the stuff you're doing?
Right on. I think like a lot of people, the trajectory may start just in music. So for me, it was like school band and marching band and then getting into orchestras and playing in rock and funk bands, and then eventually going to school for music and still doing the same things at night, playing in an orchestra in the day and then hard funk at night, and touring and that kind of stuff. So that kind of led into the studio. I think at age 16 was my first studio experience, and hearing how the sound could be changed and the emotions changed straight away just by moving an EQ or a fader or adding a particular kind of ambience or something, definitely flipped my ears up as like, what's that about? You know what I mean? So, and eventually started getting to 4-track recording on cassette and then 8-track cassette, and that moved into reel-to-reel and those kind of things. But for me, being around people that would tell me to pay attention to certain things, like what makes something cool. If anybody's ever heard me on an interview or another spot, I'm always talking about food because it's so easy to identify for all of us because it's something we do a few times a day, So it was similar to me in production. Is a friend of mine named Tiny, just the greatest dude ever, would be like, man, check out this bass line on this song, and it's stuff I didn't really pay attention to as much. I was just kind of had my soup and the chowder, and then I went on with my day, and he was like, check out this potato right here, So I started paying attention. I'd pay attention to not just drum parts. I was a drummer initially, but I was playing keyboards and stuff a bit too. And he's like, listen to the way the interaction of these two lines, and this is playing an octave up, and this is doing a harmony, and this chord is broken out between these different instruments and stuff. he just pointed out one simple thing, like check out the bass line or check out the hi-hat. And it made me listen differently to production and also how those things change within a mix and in a production, like what octave to go into, are there effects added, and all of a sudden you're kind of eating your chowder, and you're like, oh man, they use these particular kind of carrots, and this place is using pepper, and the other one's using some kind of, other kind of spice, and you start to like different things about them. And when you start listening to music in a way that you're noticing, obviously, different snare sounds or into more delicate things like frequencies, like how the presence of this vocal and the warmth of this and how wide it is in speakers and how focused it is and those kind of things, it just barrels into a production listening thing where you're paying attention, like paying attention to the trees, like, what kind of tree is that? It's amazing, it's good for this amount of time, and then it disappears and this other tree takes over, so that led me into recording more, starting to produce artists several decades ago. And it was demos at first, and then it got into being better at demos. My production skills and my arranging skills and musician skills were, progressing faster and being focused on early on more so. There wasn't as much content like we have today where you can go on and figure out how to use most anything in the world, You had to kind of know somebody and experiment. But as my skills got better all around and demos started sounding closer to records, then I started getting people asking me, like, can I hire you for, produce a record, that kind of thing. And then I got signed to a label as a solo artist that brought me to LA from North Carolina. And I started producing some things for other artists on that label and working on my own record. And that put me in Westlake studios in LA, working in the Thriller room and poking around at gear going, what is this? And the curiosity just consistently bleeds into the next curiosity. And the more studios you work in, you're hearing the different rooms, you're watching engineers decide where to put the kick drum or where to, in the room, in the acoustic space. You're seeing how people listen. I lived in LA for about, I think, 15 years. And the different studios you're working in or having people work on a project that you're working on, you kind of see how people listen and you see how their choices are informed. And not everybody's sitting in front of two monitors determining, what 2K should be doing right now or something. They're kind of like, how's this feel? And then, had several people just walk over to the door and listen and be like, oh, it feels different because I'm paying attention differently. I'm not so zoomed in, I'm zoomed out, and that changed their decisions. So I think perspective really kind of helped inform all the cooking skills you can take in, and you're learning like how to make this Moroccan thing, and you're learning how to make great Mexico City style tacos versus this other style, and you're just constantly curious about how these different things interact to make the final actual experience of, what makes this kind of soup and what makes this kind of soup for this different region. And eventually, when people ask you, hey, can you cook up one of these? You've got about 45 different recipes per thing that you can pull out and go, this would be killer. Let's use this cilantro from this side of the street and this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
man, I'm going to be so hungry by the end of this podcast.
Yeah. Oh, there is no doubt about that. But it's so easy to grasp, because all of us kind of get these things where you're like, you've had the same dish maybe in a few places and you eventually, you may have three that are great, but for different reasons, and you're like, oh, I like this for this dish and this for this version of it, and it's so easy to grasp. So yeah, that kind of sent me down that road, and I opened a couple of different studios in LA, first in Pasadena, and then I opened up a bigger one in LA for the second one. I ran about 10 years and did my career progressed a lot in there because there's so much work going on there, and there's so many people that just show up and be like, hey, I need to book a day or something, and you don't really know who's in the room. They'll bring people that are just superstars or something, or it's Wednesday and then they become superstars on the next Thursday, and you didn't even know. So it's just kind of being in the room thing. So those kind of trust things, and this is a pretty big deal for everybody out there who's trying to start a business or keep a business going or be an independent producer or mixer. It's really about, we're all trying to get the skills. You want to be able to cook, but it's about trust, because all of us as musicians or collaborators have a group of people that we know we can call that have the skills, are reliable, and maybe even more so, they're a good hang. You like hanging out with them. You don't feel like there's going to be a lot of drama that you're going to recommend them for your clients, and it's going to be some kind of sour note experience. So
of course,
I think that's a pretty big deal, is once you can gain enough people's trust that you can deliver and try to be cool to work with, that's going to give you a long career, and those people will keep coming back, just like we all do. We have friends we trust just to hang out with, The same is true for producers and engineers and musicians.
Of course.
I'm sure you've heard that so much on your podcast, but it's
it's such an important thing that it has to come up, right? And if people aren't listening, they need to hear it again. It's like it's one of those things that if you like, a lot of people don't think about it in the moment. They just kind of react, and it's like, no, you just have to kind of step back a little bit, actually think about things before you react, like instinctively sometimes, and just like be aware of this and how you interact with people and how big of a difference that makes. Because it's the difference between someone coming back to work with you throughout their entire career versus just like, this is the only time, and someone else is making that money in the long haul, right?
Yeah, and trust of course is earned and all that stuff, and it doesn't mean you can't be human and not have some emotional moments or call it like you see it, but those are dynamic relationships that, if you haven't known somebody so long and you deliver some hard line, how you deliver that, the art of tact may or may not determine how that goes from there, So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, you said something earlier that I think is a really important topic to bring up as well, which is the idea of you had a mentor or some friends of yours who were at least saying, like, listen to the bass here or listen to the hi-hats and that kind of stuff. And I think that's something that a lot of people just don't really take the time to really learn, is like that production side of it and the arrangement. It's like, we kind of, for some musicians, it's just like, I came up with a cool lick and like, I'm going to hit record and that's it. Right. Or like, you're jamming with your band and everyone just kind of does their own thing. And at the end of it, you're like, cool. We have a song, let's hit record. Right. But like, when you actually pay attention to those little details inside of the productions that we hear on the radio or whatever, it's like, you start to learn how to arrange things better, and you start to learn how to position things better in your mix, or come up with different tones. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the art of like actually listening to productions and like some of those lessons that you heard or that you learned as a result of, paying attention to these little details. Like, what are some of the things that stood out to you when you were first starting to like become aware of this stuff?
Sure. You may want to grab a seat, because this I could go on about that for so long. Almost anything.
It's a loaded question, I know.
No, it's great. It's really important to me, and not only that, but I'm almost an evangelist for how career changing and perspective changing it can be, to be able to not just notice the details, but be able to zoom out. And I think that's the thing that most, especially mix engineers, are trying to do, is learn how to get deep into details and try to figure out which ones really matter. And usually in your brain, it's all of them, and then also zoom out and going, okay, did I get into this detail and ruin the perspective of the whole overarching message, just by working on that one thing? But when we get back to the scope from as a producer or a mix engineer. There's a lot of things that are completely key to how the emotions unfold. And I say emotions, the emotional message, what energy and message is to be conveyed as a song overall, or a piece of music, whether it's a song or not, and how that's going to lay out from section to section. And that's very much back to how a meal is going to lay out. This verse is going to be a little salty and then it's going to get sweeter. We're going to add some notes as it goes through, and we're going to give you this experience that is a journey, and it's compelling from note one to the final fade or reverb tail or whatever, right? And I think kind of keeping that zoomed out approach of like, what's the message, what's the energy, is something that often takes a while to learn. Some artists just kind of get it straight away, just like, some musicians are at 3 years old or Mozart, so it is what it is. But for most people, we're given something just like a dish when you're a kid, and you're like, this is good, and you have no idea what's in it. You just get texture and you get flavor, and it's an experience. And it's like that with a lot of music. You get it, you see a painting, and you're like, it's a forest, It's not until you start looking in how it's put together that you notice there's like one yellow leaf in the left corner, and there's like a rabbit in the other side, and you didn't even notice it, and all that's part of the experience. You notice the sky and what time of day it is. This is kind of what we're doing a lot with music, is we're getting a picture, like walking into a room in somebody's house, and you straight away get a vibe, You walk in, there's a particular like scent, there's a particular color, the way the light's hitting the room, what things are in the room. Is it really minimal? Is it crowded? Is it mostly blue? Is there a bunch of yellow stuff? Is there a lot of contrast? Songs kind of give us that thing. And if you're not really paying attention to the details, you walk in and you get an experience, and it's an overall emotion. Like, whoa, that's killer. What does that mean? It means it felt killer in some way. Then you start getting down to like, why? How did it feel killer? Was it the impact at the beginning, or was it the journey of like blooming into this, delicate thing to a big assault at the end? Not really sure. So the cool thing about dissecting a production or a mix is knowing how much that each element and choice affects the next stage of production, obviously, meaning the songwriting or the composition of the piece, melodies, harmony, rhythms, all those kind of things. And then there's the sonic choices, the before the arrangement. Maybe it's like, I'm going to play this Strat through a silver face reverb or something. And I was like, okay, let's say a deluxe reverb or something. And I'm going to add a little bit of distortion, and the drummer's like, you know what, I'm going to use this fat snare drum. All those things are timbre choices, and they affect what things are going into that room. Big blocky furniture, or really minimal with some tatami mats or something. Those are feelings you're creating. The arrangement affects the mix in so many ways, because it's not really spoken very often of on the internet, because there's so much for engineering. It's so blocked off into frequencies, and it's not often correlated that frequencies are actually pitch. Mm-hmm. And with things like big bands and orchestras, before we had every sound ever made or not yet made available to us in our bedroom, in Logic or Pro Tools or Ableton or whatever, people had a piece of paper, and they had trombone and tuba and trumpet and drums and bass, and maybe they had strings and those things. And those were the presets, you know what I mean? And each one of those things, like a trombone could be really brash and have almost a sawtooth kind of vibe, or it could be kind of smooth and be a lot more like a square wave on a synth or something, depending on how the person plays it. So it's like, okay, I got my trombone, and we got like 5 presets of timbre. There's a lot more, but let's just say I'm composing and I'm arranging. And I'm like, I want this section to be really heavy and gritty on the bass frequencies, which means that maybe in the composition, I'm making arrangement choices that also affect the mix of how we're going to hear it. Is if the trombone's down here playing a low E, and I've got upright bass also playing a low E, those two together are going to make one sound, basically. One of them may be the sub bass, and one of them may be the upper mid bass somewhere. So the composer is using that timbre to literally deliver a mix of how those frequencies are going to be delivered, and also deliver how we feel it as a listener. And then they've got all these other textures, and this is such a big deal with mixing and production, is long and short notes. Like a flash of light in your eyeball like this is like, whoa. But if you blasted a laser beam in your eye and left it on, it's a whole different feeling. So similarly with short notes that are really smooth and legato versus notes that may be longer, feel more like a bath versus a drop of water on your face, So a warm bath versus a drop of something is a different feeling. And I think a lot of arrangers instinctively use those kind of things. But what register they are in, what octave, what timbre you choose as a producer or as a band. If you're in a band and I'm not a producer, but I'm making these tracks, the decisions you make to play really short staccato notes in one section and then go to open chords on the next section and then go to arpeggios on another section and strumming and what octave you're playing in, those are not only arrangement choices that affect our energy, like are those, short bursts of short notes coming at us and in what octave they're in, but also they're mix choices. So if the bass is going up 2 octaves for the verse, then there may not be a lot of weight on the verse, and that may be a feeling choice. Like, I don't want the verse to really have all this weight, and when the chorus hits, it drops down 2 octaves, and all this weight kicks in, and we immediately get this feeling like, oh, the tide just came in. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
I can't stress enough, like, the knowledge of what's happening in the arrangement can affect your mix choices, depending on what your goals, are you mixing for someone else? Are you mixing your own material? And you're like, I can't get more bottom out of this section or something. And it's like, well, let's look at the octaves and what things are in what octaves and what sounds were used in that section. Maybe that kick drum that's kind of just poking through and it's got a lot of like 180 hertz or something is killer when the bass is down an octave, but in the verse the bass is up higher and the kick drum's just kind of going dink 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 dink, so it's like, do I want more bottom there? Am I gonna layer some kind of kick drum that's got a longer note on it that's gonna have some sustain? Am I gonna use some kind of reverb or some other thing that's got that I've put low end, or let low end come through to make those notes seem longer? And those arrangement choices in just the instruments, the timbre of the instruments, and the arrangement, long and short notes and what octaves they're in, those already affect the mix. And then as a mixer, you may be adding length to notes by using reverbs or delays. A short blast of energy, like I was saying earlier, is just that, but a lot of feedback with it, or a delay is like ba-da-da-da-da-da, that's a much longer note that we perceive, even though we can hear the chops. The energy lasts longer than it would if it were short bursts. It's like opening the blinds and closing them, but if you kind of open them a little bit by using a delay or a reverb or something, it feels a bit like there's more sun in the room, and that could be at different frequencies. So that's a kind of abstract but hopefully relatable answer about things to listen for that I started to get into initially. Like I said, I was just like, listen to this part. It's cool. Listen to how it interacts. It's playing the same thing as the guitar, but down an octave, or listen to how it's long, smooth notes through this section, and then it goes to this other section, and it's playing, staccato 16th notes through this whole section, and maybe the meter or the implied meter goes from these kind of 8th note, 6th note, 16th note things in a binary like 2/4/4/4 time signature, and you go into something that feels like 6/8. It's like doom back doom tack boom tack boom boom, and the whole feeling changes. It's like the square room became a round room, and it's still blue and whatever, same stuff in the room, but you're like, whoa, new perspective. So those are choices that everybody can have in their back pocket, and the more emotional levers you can pull, it gives you a lot of interpretations, like knowing more than one chord on the guitar and knowing more ways to play that chord in different octaves and different chord inversions can deliver it in a different way and get out of the way for something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love that answer. Like, I do think, you gave some really great examples, like that whole, was it orchestra section you were talking about? You were talking about like, having your brass and your horns and all that kind of stuff, and like kind of determining which one's providing the low end, which one's not. Like it is so relevant to how we make music these days, and I think that is something that a lot of people, again, just like, oh, it sounds cool, I'll play it like this, but then when you actually like do step back and you're like, okay, wait a minute, like where did that low end go? Like, if I play the bass higher up on the neck, like who's filling in the low end because it's not there anymore, like. That these are things
maybe that's cool, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that is cool. But if like the mix is feeling weak, maybe it's because you should play it a little lower on the neck. Like things like that sometimes are like the smallest differences, the smallest changes that can make the biggest difference. And that is why it's so important to pay attention to those little details. And I would definitely recommend that anyone who's listening to this podcast, like, take the time to actually listen to the music that you're listening to, like on a deeper level, like not just from a personal enjoyment perspective, but like actually pay attention to the way things interact. Because, all of this stuff is so important. And when you start to actually pay attention to those things, you can start to discover, what actually makes a song sound as big as it does, or why a hit is a hit. What are these little elements that come together? It doesn't mean you're always going to produce every song you're going to work on is going to be a massive success, but it's like at least understanding how the responses are triggered by the arrangement, or how people learn to dance to a song or that kind of thing. It all comes down to just like paying attention to these interactions of all of the instruments in the arrangement. So
totally. And it's all music doesn't sound the same, and that's the beauty of all the choices we have, but they're so related in, we're literally playing rhythms and melodies and harmonies, and some of them have focus on one more than the other, and one element is like a dish with just 2 ingredients can be amazing if those ingredients are so great, it's quality in some way, if they're really telling the truth in some way. But I think if you see the correlation of like, kind of like humanity, we're just a bunch of bones and some brains and some choices. I think music is similar. We got a bunch of long notes and short notes and a bunch of different timbre, and the way we split up, literally frequencies from what we can hear to the other end of what we can hear. What are we going to do with this palette? And then in the mix, in stereo mix, we've got left to right, center, and then I've been doing Atmos and stuff, so now you have got a much wider palette, and you think about, what am I going to do with the space that people are going to hear, and how's it going to translate in headphones, and all that stuff it's so similar. So it's even more exciting when you're paying attention and you're like, whoa, I love how these 2 instruments were chosen to play those sounds. They're playing the third, and they're playing the root in that chord.
Yeah.
And the way those 2 timbres work together, and maybe one's short and one's long. So one timbre is the tail of the note, and the other one's the attack. So after having after I dove into synthesis and those kind of things years ago, you start to see the correlation of all these different things in acoustic music and in, synthetic music, sample music, attack, decay, sustain, release, and how different parts of the sound can be layered, and you're back to the big band or something again. You're going,
Exactly.
oh,
Yeah.
they're doing pizzicato while these other things are doing the sustain of that same chord, and it's cool.
Yeah. Well, you also brought up another good point there too, of like you talked about like how you're getting into Atmos and all that, and like this conversation like it totally applies to creating wide mixes, and that is something that I know a lot of people have a lot of trouble with sometimes too. It's like they're not sure where to put things or how to get their mixes sound bigger, but it really does come down to the arrangement. And if you're like maybe I'm just a visual person, but like I always kind of picture like in front of me, like where is everything supposed to be sitting in the mix? Like, if I have one thing on the left, what's compensating for it on the right? Or do I want my mix to feel lopsided? Like those are the kind of decisions you sometimes need to make. And if you feel like it's lopsided, well then what's going on the right? Like, are we going to double apart? Are we going to fill it out over there? Like those are the sort of things that you need to be aware of so that you can create that spot, that space. And especially when you go into something like Atmos or any sort of surround where you've now expanded that field, like you have to be constantly aware of that. You don't surround sounds mixes sound really boring when everything is in the center only, like it doesn't do anything, right? So you gotta have fun with it and like plan where things go, and from there you can create something exciting and create that atmosphere, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think somebody who's been around at some point mentioned their just in music there's all these different dynamic levels, pianissimo and fortissimo and ranges all in between, and there's not really there's a reference of what the middle is before you can have any kind of contrast, so if your mix is wide the whole time, that can be a really cool experience as well. But a lot of times mixes that have contrast, and even though your acoustic guitars were wide in the chorus, maybe you want to bring them in the verse, and maybe that's a more intimate experience as you're going on the journey of listening. And these are things you may not notice as a listener. It's just the field kind of collapsing and expanding, and not just in how wide you do things, but what frequencies you use, and to feature going wide or going narrow and those kind of things. Like, are the higher frequencies still up the middle? Is it just the vocal up the middle, and the things in the left and right speakers are either mixed a little darker, or maybe in the arrangement their chord voicings are a little lower, and then when the chorus hits, all these new octaves of whatever high chimey guitars or bell synths or whatever give you this feeling like somebody opened the blinds, and it's like there's high frequency content now, not just up the middle where maybe a female vocal was that has a lot of extra air and top end, but when the chorus hits, maybe the whole mix, the sky opened over the whole mix and the sun came out, and then it may collapse again or get dark. It may still be wide in the bridge, but the frequencies that are used may not be all as much high frequency content on the bridge, because you kind of want the lighting to be a little more blue than a shiny sunny day, so those kind of contrasts, both in arrangement, what octave you're in, what voicing you use, and also the way you mix it, are the things that can sometimes feel like, not necessarily that you're getting bored, because a mix doesn't have to change at all if, like I say, if one or two elements are so unbelievably compelling, the mix would never have to move, just like a person singing solo or one guitar and vocal, and you never do any width or any kind of changes, but the lyrics or the melody is just so much the truth that you're engaged, the whole time. But sometimes the combination of all those, if the song's really compelling, and then the mix is blooming and collapsing and getting thicker on the bottom, and then maybe it's it's not as thick, or maybe it's focused on the rhythm in this section, and then it's focused on texture in the next section, and we've got all these levers that can deliver a 20-course meal and make it amazing.
For sure. And that's a really good point that you brought up too, of like you don't need to throw everything at it to make your mix sound fuller or bigger. Like sometimes the simplest solution is all that you need, right? Like just like you said, an acoustic guitar or a vocal only. Like if that is compelling enough and that's got like all the energy you need, then great. You've created that connection with the listener. That's the most important part. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, especially in a dense arrangement. I was mentioning earlier, someone mentioned that, you know, there is not necessarily a loud without a soft, or a softer, or there's not
hmm
necessarily a fat without a thin to compare it against, you know. And in a dense mix, the mix can sound fat, but you know, as you know, you start soloing things, and things may have all kinds of things carved out with of the sound, and it may sound a little thin on its own. Maybe you've carved out a lot of low end and some, and say 300, etc., below, all the way below that for acoustic guitars, and maybe even higher. And on their own, they're kind of like, oh, that's not really a full guitar sound that I'd put behind one vocal. But in the mix, all the sparkle and the string strumming attack and whatnot is cutting through the mix, and the other things that are ringing out the whole time are not in the way of these other keyboard parts that need to be in that octave more predominant, you know.
hmm
So even if the keyboards and the guitars are playing the same chords with the same voicing, you may use one more for the attack. Maybe it's the strumming guitars, and the Rhodes or something, you may be taking out some of the attack clunky part and using it more for the sustain of the low mids or something. All those are back to that same thing I was saying earlier, is who's doing what part of what chord. You know, are they focused on the long part of the note they're playing, or is it the whole note, or is it just part of the note that I want to hear? You know what I mean?
yeah,
So
yeah. I love that. That's great. Yeah, it reminds me of like one of my mentors used to always say that like everything in music breaks down to one of three categories. It's either rhythmic, it's melodic, or it's harmonic. And when you decide on what role each instrument is supposed to be, that kind of dictates what to do with it in a mix. You know, if like maybe the the percussive stuff, it's like you just want to bring out the attack of it. You want to have that percussive feel. So maybe like that could be an acoustic guitar, just just like trying to bring it a little bit more pick attack. And if that's what that role is in the song, then you don't need all the body of that guitar. You can just focus a little bit on more of the pick side of it. And if you bring that out, then mission accomplished. So it's like kind of starting to analyze your tracks that way, and realize like, okay, what is this actually contributing to the overall arrangement and to the mix of it? Once you start doing that, it makes mixing a lot easier. So yeah, I love the way you put it, and like it's so relevant. It's having it's like all of this stuff. It's like you have to be aware of it, and I think a lot of people, it's just like music is just like an emotional kind of thing, and we just kind of go with it, and sometimes that does lead to really good things. But sometimes when you're struggling with an idea, or you're not quite sure why your mix isn't working, it's like start to like step back a little bit and analyze like what's actually going on under the hood here. And I think once you get into that, that's when you can really start to piece things together to fit right in the mix.
yeah, totally.
It seems like you're very like methodical about the way you approach your productions, and so I'm curious to know, like, when I know you do a lot of producing. When you start producing a record for a band or for an artist, like, how involved do you get from the production standpoint? Like, do you get involved in the songwriting, or is that does that differ based on project to project?
Um, well, a lot of what you're hearing now and me talking about it is focusing on my awareness, but I'm not. When I'm interacting with musicians, I'm not running through a checklist of whether they're hitting any of these things in particular. It's more an awareness, just like learning a bunch of guitar licks, and you're not thinking about this applies for number 37 lick. I'm going to put this in, and I'm not. There's always a bit of analysis if you're hearing rhythms you've heard a lot before or something. It's kind of in your brain, but there's definitely a lot of it's seriously about the emotion and all that stuff. So when you're not thinking about, these are the things that you do when you're critically listening and learning, and you take those experiences with you, like practicing how to jump out of the way of a car. When it happens, you're not evaluating it, you just do it because you've been paying attention to how to do it. You know what I mean? Not the best example, but as far as production and interaction with artists, I've been fortunate to work on a lot of different styles of records, and it can vary a lot in that maybe an artist has a very specific vision and a lot of extra skills that go with it in arranging and other things. that I'm somewhat kind of a shepherd a bit of like taking all these great ideas and not just saying, here's how it's going to go down. It's a lot of conversations about the message, literally that, because I can produce a record in so many different ways. And when you've got these different kind of lightings to look at things, it's like taking a photo and saying which Instagram filter best represents how you want to depict yourself, and the conversations with an artist are like, what things are you into? What things have inspired you? Maybe it's music, maybe it's records, but maybe it's about the message. Because I'm a as you may tell, I'm a very visual kind of person.
Nah.
So when I'm hearing the message, I want to know, like, I don't have to know all this stuff, but it's bonus content if somebody can tell me, where they were when they were going through it, kind of describe some stuff. And because I want to know more about just the black and white words, the lyric. It's like, what were you going through? They're like, oh, I was in New Orleans and it was really rainy and this kind of thing. And it's like, and you listen to their record differently, the demos differently, because you start to hear the weather, you know what I mean? You start to hear why they chose those guitar sounds or why they sang this song more gravelly, because it's not just like, oh, that's cool, you use this vocal effect, or something. It's like, why did you do it? And these are the things that inform our choices. And that connects more to like when I say about how I'm getting a perspective. You make those choices in production about how you want to frame it. And if the artist isn't really sure, but they've just got killer songs, then we have conversations about what they're into and how we want to deliver that energy through the whole album and what instruments are chosen. If I'm playing all the instruments, then it's even more like, what sounds are we going to use? Are they very organic, classic, acoustic, or electric instruments, or is it synthetic, or is it a combination of those kind of textures? And maybe some different eras, because obviously recording from Motown through the 70s and Beatles stuff, and then to the 80s with big gated reverbs and giant snare drums, and the 90s super dry, giant loud rock records, and on into the 2000s and current day is all these kind of new production tools. So there's this kind of conversation of like, what's the lighting like? What era do you like sounds from and you feel very connected to that need to express the message in this record? Because it's not always about my choice, because I may hear a record that they're singing right away and get a vision of like, this would be killer if, but I'm not here to make you sound like, McKay Garner featuring you. I want to know what it is that you're about. And if I'm not the person to play certain instruments, I may play nothing on a record. Or with a band, it may just be about arrangements or capturing the right performance. Or like, I wonder if the bridge should be, twice as long, or maybe we should do this vocal up an octave because it has a different feeling here, and getting the tempos right, getting the key right, those kind of things. Because things like the key and the tempo are like choosing orange versus yellow, it's just a little bit of different tweak of a lever, and you're like, man, that just feels, but it, if you've done it, straight away when you get tempo or the key or something is a little darker, and it's like, this one's a little too light blue for that rainy New Orleans thing. We need to go down a half step, and get into this range of the voice, or down tune the guitars or something. Those are really the conversations I have with, like, what are you into? Because it's easy enough to go, I'm in the studio, this guy produces records, and just start recording stuff. I like to know, like, what's the message? Because it's honestly the records that really resonate with me, and I think most everybody on a human level, is, does it sound like the truth? Do I believe what you're saying right now? And that doesn't mean just the lyrics. It might be a guitar performance. It might be a sound you chose or something that could be so abstract, and I've never heard that message heard that way, but I'm like, I believe it straight away. And if it feels like it's just been produced to try to check some boxes that are popular, but I don't believe the message, then it's more like, oh, this is cool. I like the snare sound, or, I really like the way the guitars do this. And that can be great too, its own value, but getting performances that feel like that's the best that person has told the story, wherever they are in their practice or their artist journey, the more they've been doing it and the more connected they are to that antenna of their authentic message, the easier it is to just hit record. But that can vary from day to day. It's hard to go back to, I wrote the song when I lost my mom or something, and it's like if somebody just comes in out of traffic and they spilled their coffee on themselves, they're not thinking about that, You may get the completely wrong vocal, and you need to know when it's like, that was a good take, you're in pitch and all this stuff, but were you believing it? Were you there? You know what I mean? And you're like, you know what? Let's do this again tomorrow. See what we get. And tomorrow may not be it either. So you may need to sit down, let's take a walk. Let's take a drive over here and let's have a conversation about what's really going on. Because if you're not in the headspace, if you're not angry enough to deliver Rage Against the Machine or something in a particular message, and you're just kind of going through the pitches and the words, it's like it doesn't feel like I believe you until I believe you.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna harp on you about that. I think that's the thing about being a producer is like, how do you get there without you're constantly making decisions which involve some kind of judgment. So how do you navigate, like, how did you feel like that, and as the final decision makers, whether you're the producer or the artist, artist is always involved because it's their record, their face on it. But if they trust me, it's like, let's talk about this. And here's why I feel like I've heard you do some things that might translate to being the truth more. Let's try some of those things, or maybe it's just not working in that octave, or maybe it's let's try this other approach. Let's try a new headphone mix. Just that alone, could be like, you're used to singing the guitar and we've got this giant mix coming at you, let's just mute everything and just leave the guitar, and immediately you may get something completely different because you've taken everything out of the room and you're like, it was just you in the chair and the guitar in your headphones, So
it's all one giant therapy session, whether, it's like coaching someone through their session.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Whether it's coaching someone through their performance or just like taking away elements or whatever, it's like that therapy session just to make it all like feel authentic and to have that emotion like right there in the song. And I love what you said about like feeling the songs and, feeling the emotion of someone. And as soon as you said that, I started thinking of like some of my favorite records, and it's like, there's certain songs that just really stand out to me, and it's like, oh yeah, because like I believe those way more, like it's hell that they were just like, I listen to a lot of like punk rock and stuff like that, and it's like, I think there's a lot of punk rock artists that like don't believe in what they say. It's like, if you're gonna fight for something and have like a political message or something like that, like feel it. Don't just write something for the sake of it.
Right.
So it's
or
like,
they believed it, but they didn't record that day, where they were believing it. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, we got to do 8 songs today, and I believe 2 of them. When I did it, we should have come back tomorrow.
Yeah. For sure. Well, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was I know that you do a lot of work for, you've had a lot of music featured in like film and TV and video games and that kind of stuff. And so I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. And it kind of makes sense now that we're starting to talk here, and I'm realizing how visual of a person you are when it comes to like your music. It kind of makes sense that like writing for these visual mediums would probably be right up your alley, because it's just another extension of that visual feel. So I'm wondering, like, where does somebody begin if they're like hoping to have their music licensed or write for film and TV? Like, how does somebody get into that kind of field?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually haven't done that in a very long time, because I've always been working on records, but I produced a record for an amazing friend and guitar player, and he happened to be in charge of publishing for a very famous publishing company and was music supervisor on a bunch of shows. And he's like, dude, you can play some different instruments and you got a studio and do some tracks, you know? So that's one of those diversification kind of choices that a lot of us can make of like, what do you do with your downtime? You know what I mean? We're all trying to learn new stuff, perfect our craft, practice our instruments, go through 7,000 reverbs and figure out which one you like for this sound, and you know, and all these things, plus run our businesses. But there's something great about. I'm glad I did a lot of that because it's some of it's just been paying me for years, and it's how often do you do a day's work and then it pays you, you know what I mean? So
That's a dream.
those kind of choices are the difference between what nowadays is called content, but it's a product basically that keeps getting licensed to be synchronized with TV or film or something like that. So much like having your music hit, you know, it just keeps getting put in rotation. And for me, getting into several, there's all these different ways that you can get into that. There's different revenue streams. There's music for TV libraries, meaning it could just be a particular style. Like here's a whole bunch of techno, or here's a whole bunch of X, you know, this era of rock, or, you know, this is all chip tune and this is all singer-songwriter. So you can put together a certain number of tracks that fit a genre that you find that might be used a lot in television, and start to build your library. And you're like, you know, I've got Wednesday off, I'm going to do a library track. If you can, that's the creating content side of it, meaning that you're building up libraries. So that's one revenue stream, that these are pieces of music that different people that need music are going to be licensing that music for their uses. And then you have specific requests that may be, they're going to end up in a library, but they've got a specific request. And some of those could be sound-alikes, like we need something that has the feeling of Billie Eilish, you know? So you're like, all right, I'm going to work on that track. It's not just a genre, it's very specific. Like I need a Ramones kind of sounding thing. So those are more specific, and there's usually that already has, it has a definite spot that somebody's looking for. So you're like, okay, that's getting placed. Will it be my track or somebody else's will be determined by, you know, which one of us gets that gig. So those are two sides of the TV world, is general library stuff and then specific requests that may be mood based or maybe sound alikes or something like that. Those eventually usually get put into library as well, but they have an immediate placement or need for those. And then you've got, of course, commercials, music for commercials, which is a highly competitive. It usually has a similar like request for music that is a particular vibe, or maybe it's they use a reference like this needs to be kind of like, you know, YMCA by the Village People, but not that, you know. So it might have a feeling or something. This needs to be this particular band. That's commercial music, and that's potentially going to have a short run of how long the commercial runs. Something like TV music, I've had stuff that's been on hit shows that goes into reruns for years and goes international and goes into reruns over there. So your royalties can go down in the States and then go up all of a sudden overseas or something, you know. So with commercials, it's usually a short run, and you can potentially make a grip of money, and then that's kind of it for that, unless it goes to the library or something for other uses. And then you have trailer music, as you've seen movie trailers, and that's its own specific technique and what's popular at the time. Movie trailer music kind of has these seasons of what they're using consistently. I remember a couple of years ago, it was remakes, like, you know, a very vibey, modern female singer doing her version of a Led Zeppelin track, and there are a lot of classic, well-known tunes. It was kind of like remake the cover of these songs used in movie trailers a good bit. And then there's TV and film composition, meaning that you're literally the composer for a TV show, or you're a composer for a film, hired to do either all of the music for that show, like Seinfeld or something. I'm going back, I'm using these examples.
I've been watching the entire Seinfeld series from beginning to end recently, so it's great.
Well, these are really, they're so popular that they're familiar. And then film composition. Some films may use some popular songs which are licensed. Maybe something you produced gets put into a movie and they used it in a scene where there's a club and they're like, all right, we need this banging track for this club scene. And they use a track, but they also have a composer which may be doing all the other music for the show, So each one of those is its own discipline and has its own nuances of what you need to be able to do. And getting a job as a film composer usually entails having a degree in composition and arranging or similar, just because they really need to know that you can be trusted if they don't know you. If you're Danny Elfman or something, and maybe you do or don't have a degree in as a composer, your body of work and maybe your demo reels are just so bananas that they're like, oh my God, okay, your honorary doctorate has just arrived, So, but I would recommend for people out there that it's a real revenue stream, but it can take a while. Like if your music got placed in a TV show tomorrow, it's probably going to be a minimum of 9 months before you see any income from it, because there's a production cycle of the show, and then they pay out the front end of that, which would be the sync license, and then the back end royalties start coming in from ASCAP or BMI or something incrementally, and they may be really small at first. And if the show gets picked up and takes off, then it can do really well, and you might start seeing that money really increase. It's kind of interesting because you don't really know what it's going to be. You don't know if the show's going to hit. You don't know how much the royalty's going to be. You don't know if they're going to feature your song in a scene that is just background music, or is like the couple on Grey's Anatomy just broke up and they feature you and your vocal, and all that stuff pays differently, So you're not really sure. You're just kind of, my wife and I used to watch some of the shows many years ago that had music on, and we'd sit there with a stopwatch, and be like, oh my God, 45 seconds, or that was a minute and a half, and what time it plays and all that stuff determine how much money you're going to make on it, So if you're at home and you're making a bunch of tracks, start researching what shows are using what kind of music, and find some shows that have music in your style, and maybe don't send your latest trap beats to somebody who only uses country music on their show or something, but you can reach out to them on LinkedIn or wherever and say, hey, I see you do this show and you're using this kind of music, and it's great the way you're placing music and using it for the show. Do you have any other shows you're working on that might be using, trap beats or something that I'm working on? And just start creating a relationship and be persistent about that. Check in every month or something, circle back, because as artists, we tend to think if we don't hear anything, that means no. Like they didn't love it straight away, but people are just super busy, man. There's just so many emails and so much music you can, if that's your job, and it's my job and several other people's job to listen to music and all day, So if you, in the middle of your day, you've got to listen to parts of music. If you're looking for specific things, then that's your gig, but music supervisors can just get bombarded with stuff that's just not relevant to what they're working on, So if you can do some of the work for them, and you've got a bigger chance, I think, of potentially getting your music placed somewhere that it's really going to get used, and you'll be glad you did it. You're like, well, I might not make any money today, but there are several times where I didn't know something was going to that show is going to hit so hard, and 2 hours work is like paying you for 20 years. You're like, whoa,
That's the
that
dream,
was a
man.
smart
That's the
move
goal.
that day that I made that one drum beat and it's on this show all over the world.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's amazing advice, and I think it's totally relevant. Like, people do need to understand the market that they're getting into and kind of what people are looking for. What advice do you have in terms of like finding the right people? Because it's one thing to like be submitting the right kind of tracks, but like to find these music supervisors, a lot of people don't know who to look for or how to get in touch with these people, or if they should go through like an agency or a publisher, that kind of thing. Like, where how does somebody find the right person to get their music licensed?
yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the perfect person to answer that, but I can give you some feedback on that. Is you know, oftentimes there may be credits to pay attention to at the end of movies and shows and see who's just start writing some names down and making notes, put together a spreadsheet of like, you know what, I saw this name listed on this show. You can search LinkedIn, of course, for music supervisors, and then, you don't necessarily have to hit them up straight away. Try to do some research, try to figure out what they're working on, and what may be online on LinkedIn or wherever they are may be 6 months old and may be on another show. But if you know a bit about their work, even in the past year, past 2 years or something, then that can give you an idea of what their track record is. And if you see they're working on a lot of big shows, you're like, okay, they've got a lot of authority to get music really working for me. So let me see what I have in my library of either stuff I've produced or things I've written and recorded myself. Because I've done that as well. I've had several records or EPs, etc., that I've produced that I've signed with the same publisher or other publishers, and I'm like, it takes those records a little further because suddenly they're featured in a major TV show, or maybe they made it to a commercial or something. So making those connections not only helps the artist, but it helps me too, because things that I've produced, I like to see them get as much visibility as possible. So if they end up in a a Mercedes commercial or something like that, it helps pay the artist back some of the recording costs that has been incurred for us making the record, and it gives them some temporary or potentially long-term visibility. If they get the theme song to a show or something like that, it just repeats and it pays a lot more and all that stuff. So just opening the doors is, we want to get music heard. So I think it's a matter of trying to look at as many lists as you can, like who's got a list of music supervisors for 2022, and does it say what shows they're on? If not, I've got a bunch of names. Let me go on the web and research, find that name and what they're working on, reach out, come up with a really engaging email that's not as long as my mouth talks, but maybe an email that's introducing yourself, that you'd like to be a trusted resource for particular music, and send direct links to some material that you think is relevant to maybe things they're working on, with the option to explore other stuff. But don't just go, here's my webpage, there's 7,000 songs on it, I hope you find one you like. It's rare that somebody's gonna do that.
Yeah, there's too many barriers in that case. It's like, first they got to like read your email and feel compelled enough to like get to the end of it. Then they got to click on your link, and then they got to go finding the right track. Like, there's too many roadblocks there. So it's like, make it easy for them. And I love the point that you brought up. It's such a simple thing, but it's so relevant. Like the idea of just watching TV credits. It's like back in the day, people would read album credits and be like, oh, like I want to work with so and so, or I want to have like Chris Lord Algae mix my stuff because he does everything. Like, it's like you read the credits and you're like, oh, that person is the person that's everyone goes to for that kind of thing. So yeah, like TV credits, it's one of those things that they're not the most entertaining to watch, and that entertaining show that you just finished is done, but there's some value after the show's over to if you're looking to get your license or your music license. So yeah, it's such a simple technique, but uh, it's definitely very useful. So yeah, people should definitely take advantage of that. You'd brought up the idea of like content libraries
Mm-hmm.
and how there's people that write for that kind of stuff, and it's just like amassing a catalog. Do you recommend that people experiment with lots of different genres of music when they're building up that library, or is it better to like focus on a specific sound or a specific genre and kind of be known as the person for that kind of sound?
Mm. Versatility is great. I like to be versatile, and I think a lot of us like a lot of styles of music. But if there are certain things that you can rock it out, like I would spend both your time and your money. If you're recording and doing all that yourself, and if maybe mixing isn't your best skill yet, and you're working on it, maybe you can collaborate with someone to mix it on the level that you need to have it presentable for TV or whatever you're placing it in, and work a deal with that. And you'd have a partner, and it's like, okay, we're using our two skills to make this the best it can be. But if you can do it all, then try to focus on the things that you can rock out. And you're like, okay, I am reggae guy, and I'm gonna do 50 reggae tracks, and you can probably do really well with. It comes back to that same thing. Like, does it sound like the truth? You know what I mean? It's so good and so authentic. That's like, it doesn't sound like a TV version. And that's not really a great thing to say or perspective, because there's so much music that's used on TV that can just be so killer, but there's this kind of initial feeling, because early on, as cable and streaming was really getting more and more popular, so much music needed, and some of it just had such a low budget that the music just sounds like it was partially recorded in 3 places and not really mixed and whatnot. So you started to get this kind of reputation of some of it being TV music. But then as artists and labels and all that stuff changed into streaming, budgets became way different, and what used to cost to license a Gwen Stefani track or something was now like, oh, you're not competing with that, you're now competing with that because people aren't making quite the same they were selling CDs that they are in streaming and other things, or at least that was that way for a while. So I think really doing something you're really great at, and trying to get that content. And even if your mix skills aren't ready, start creating all the content, get great performances, get the productions dialed into the format they need to be. If it's TV, maybe it's 1.5 minutes and it has a definite intro, it has an A section, it has a B section, and then it has a definite outro. And do a bunch of pieces like that and go, well, mixing isn't my forte, but I'm going to do 50 tracks, and then I'm going to get them, a bunch of stuff mixed, or I'm going to mix 5 at a time or something. So if you don't have the skills or the budget right now, don't say, I'll do that later when I've got the skills. The content is key, so don't miss an opportunity by going, I'll do that when I'm better. If you know the style and you can play it right now, don't let your mastering skills or your inability to buy the new studio monitors you wanted to buy, tell you not to go in the studio and do it, or your bedroom or whatever, and knock out some content. Because if you've got good performances and decent sounds and the truth is there, it's easier to make that kill later with a mix.
Totally. I think of my own band, and like some of our earlier recordings were just so rough, and like I'm embarrassed by them. But we eventually got better, and we started going to better studios, and like we had like way better, more pro sounding mixes by the end of our time together. But funny enough, like the songs that we got licensed, even when we had those better quality tracks, were the ones that were recorded in our basement, like,
Totally.
and when I hear them on TV and stuff, I'm like, oh man, this sounds awful. But like, but somebody liked it enough that they chose it. Right. So it's like, to your point, like, you don't be waiting till you're ready or you're perfect at it. Like sometimes just like having that catalog of stuff is all you need to get started and to create that momentum. Right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of producers or artists do that, is they're feeling it like they got a new song and they're really feeling it, but they won't record it because they're like, no, my new mic is, I can't buy that until next month or something. And I get it. There's a little bit of like, oh, I don't want to get this great performance on my 57, you know, because I know it'll be better on my U47 I'm getting next month or something, you know. It's like you can't necessarily turn that antenna off. Once you shut it off, it's going to be different next month. You know, you may kill it, you know, it may be even better. But, you know, when you've got kind of the tingles, the connection happening of like, I'm really feeling what I'm saying right now, then do what you can to get it down with what you got the best you can, because technology is bananas right now. The stuff we can make sound good out of something that maybe, you know, would have been really hard to make sound good 10 or 20 years ago. It's crazy. Like I've had so many recordings where you just couldn't make it sound great, and you've got stuff like, you know, isotope declipper, and you've got ways to extract drums from, you know, a stereo Zoom recording of your little Zoom recorder or something, and trigger the kick and the snare and do all these other things to turn it into this giant sounding record from something you recorded in your recording space. You know, that takes a little bit of skill, but if you waited till later to capture a snapshot of that experience, it's like the sun might have gone down on that, and it's just not going to be the same sunset. You know, it's like, I'll wait till fall, and you're like, yeah, the leaves changed. It's not a spring photo anymore like you were feeling. You know,
that's a great point.
Funny.
Yeah, I actually think that that's a perfect spot to wrap up, because yeah, it's so true. Like, don't put off going after your goals right now. It's like you're working on stuff and you're excited by it. Just act on it, you know, and you will see the benefits of it if you just push yourself to go for it. Because yeah, the best time to, like, you know, they always say like the best time to like get into real estate was like 20 years ago or like, you know, or whatever, right? It's like, it's always in the past. So, you know, you're in this moment now, just enjoy it and like jump on it, and you know, put yourself out there, and you'll see the benefits of that. So yeah, man, I love everything you had to say here today. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that was my interview with McKay Garner, and that was a great interview. I thought he did an amazing job of detailing the different revenue streams for people who are looking to write music for film and TV, and some of the different approaches that you can take to get your music featured. And I thought he gave some really great tips there for how to find the right people and how to prepare your music and how to, you know, pitch it to them in a way that can hopefully actually land you some licensing gigs. And I thought that he brought up a really great point about the idea of when you're licensing your music, it's not always just a one-time payment and you're done. Instead, it can actually be an incredible recurring revenue stream. And when you get enough songs licensed, you kind of just build this foundation of royalties that you can collect every year, and it can be quite lucrative. I know people that are literally making thousands of dollars each and every year for songs that they had written 10, 20 years ago, all because they got their music licensed in the right shows or shows that play often. So there's definitely a lot of money to be made here, and this is definitely another revenue stream that a lot of people should explore, because if you're working on amazing music, maybe your goal isn't to be a rock star and to tour and to play lots of gigs. Maybe your songs can be better off used in film and television, and that is your niche. That is the market that you should be focusing on. So I hope that you found that enlightening and that you now have a much better idea of how that industry works and how you might be able to profit off of it. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode, and if you did, definitely make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And also make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. That is where I help out musicians with creating pro-sounding recordings from your home studio. So whether you're working on music to, you know, record your own record, or maybe you are working on music for licensing and you're trying to get the quality of your tracks up so that they sound pro and they compete with everything else that you hear out there, check out MasterYourMix.com, because that's where I've got a ton of great resources designed to help make the process of mixing your music easy. And one resource that you definitely want to check out is called The Mixing Mindset. That is a book that I put out a while ago that became an Amazon #1 bestseller. And inside of the book, I walk you through the entire process of mixing your tracks, from knowing what tools to use, what to listen for, what to boost, what to cut, when to be using effects, when to be using automation, and so much more. That book just breaks it down and makes it super simple. So once again, that's called The Mixing Mindset, and you're going to want to check that out at MasterYourMix.com. So that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to talk to you in the next one. Take care. Later. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.